Hello there, ladies and gents. Now, all going well, this video will have reached YouTube by the 8th of August. And that is significant because on the 8th of August, there was a monumental constitutional movement in the British Parliament, essentially. Now, Parliament in Britain has for a long time been bicameral, which means it has two chambers. It's still like this day, it has been for ages. I do not know the date of Simon de Montfort's first Parliament. That was not bicameral, I think that was all just one. But a very long time ago it split, and you get two houses, as they're known, the House of Commons, which we all know a fair bit about, I would say. We know who's in that, we know, who runs the procedures in the House of Commons. And then there is the mystifying House of Lords, or House of Peers, as it's sometimes called, because Lords can be variously known as peers. It's a bit confusing, it's not important, don't worry. And this really dumbfounds some people. They think, what on earth is the House of Lords for? Because it's not like some countries, like America, for example, is another bicameral system. And they have, or what do they call it? Well, anyway, they've got the two houses, basically. I don't know what they're called because American politics is boring and rubbish. But yeah, they've got their upper house where they're governors, I think. Oh no, they're not. No. I'm not going to try and talk about American politics, but I know the upper house has got some kind of representative function and the lower house has some kind of elective function. But here in Britain, that's not really how that works, because you've got the House of Commons, which has 650 MPs, each one being elected by a plurality in a constituency. I'll put the constituency map up here for you. So that's each one of those little outlined areas. That's drawn up by the Boundaries Commission, Electoral Boundaries Commission. And each of those, when there's a general election, you actually have 650 local elections. And each of these areas returns one member of Parliament who goes and sits in Westminster. Now, the House of Lords, however, is the upper chamber. That's what it's called. And yet there's no kind of representative function there. Lords, when you become a lord, actually, what you at least I'm informed that what you get to choose is you get to choose your lordly name and your lordly place. So, for example, if I became a lord, I might choose to be, the first Viscount Bond, because that's my surname, of Heworth, because that's a place I like and live nearby. I don't technically live in Heworth, I live in Huntington, but Huntington's a bit dreadful, and Heworth is much nicer, and I've got family that live in Heworth, 2 generations, though notably they don't bear the name Bond, they're on my mother's side, but it's an incredible tangent, you'll have to forgive me. Yes, so I might be the Lord Bond of Heworth, but I could also, I don't have to choose Bond because that's my surname. I could be the Lord Vader. My politics teacher, Adam Tomes, a delightful chap, even though he is a socialist. He says that if he ever gets made a peer, created a peer. If he ever is created a peer, then he shall be the Lord Vader of Simbalk Lane, which is quite funny. Simbalk Lane is where York College is, by the way. But yes, so you get to choose your name and your place. But if Adam Tomes did get into the House of Peers, and he were the Lord Vader of Simbalk Lane, or I were the Lord Bond of Heworth, I wouldn't actually do anything to represent the people of Heworth. I don't actually. It's not like, because this has its origins in feudal times, right? This is how cool of a country we live in Britain. This has its origins in feudal times. So back then, you might actually have been, the Earl of Warwickshire, and you would exercise direct control, or indirect through your knights and their serfs and whatnot, over Warwickshire. Whereas nowadays, if I'm the Lord Bond of Heworth, that's just a naming convention that comes from the past, when people actually did used to own, things, tithings, and what's the word, homage, and all that sort of thing. I don't actually own Heworth. I just get to name myself of Heworth as part of my style, I think the word is. So it kind of defeats a lot of people in what the point of the House of Lords is, because it serves no purpose on that front. It's just a very, very large body of men. I think it's the second largest legislative body in the world, second only to the Assembly of the Chinese Communist Party, which, as you may know, represents the most populated country on the planet. So it's swollen is a word that some people like to use. Now, we shall get to this in turn, because this has nothing to do with the events of the 8th of August 1911, which is a turning point in the British Constitution. Now, allow me to set the scene for you, right? Back in those days, the House of Lords was not as it is today. The House of Lords was a real power, right? Because nowadays, you must imagine the House of Commons, right? Basically, if Keir Starmer wants something to happen, it will happen. Because, sorry, Sir Keir Starmer. As much as I dislike the man, he earned that knighthood for what I would say is a good reason, and because I believe in the system of honorifics, and you know, I like other people's knighthoods to be respected. I am duty-bound by my own principles to respect Sir Keir's honorifics. So yes, if Sir Keir wants something to happen in the House of Commons, it will happen, it will be passed into law. But if Sir Keir was Prime Minister in the House of Commons in 1911, he would have a much, much harder time of doing that job, because the House of Lords is not some docile, you know, what's the word, stepping stone. It was a legislative house, just like the House of Commons is nowadays. And this story that I'm going to tell you in very, very brief terms, very, very, you know, glossed over terms, because I am not a historian. I am a teenage boy with too many books and too much time on his hands. I'm not a historian. Please, I'm not a historian. What I have done is read something that a historian and a journalist actually has written. This is the book for which the information for this video has come, and there's a documentary series that goes with it actually, which is very good. I can recommend. It's all on YouTube actually. If you just type in Andrew Marr making of modern Britain, it will come up, a big playlist. So I can thoroughly recommend that, because it's got loads of interesting topics, of which this book contains. Not sure that was entirely correct word structure there, but yeah, it's got loads of interesting stuff, and he delivers it with much more authority and much more, what's the word, knowledge than I have. Yes, so this is where it comes from. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, but also I'm going to gloss over things, because why would I just recite what Andrew Marr wrote? That would be completely pointless, because you know, I'm not just going to plagiarise Marr. But these are historical facts. Andrew Marr does not have a copyright over 1911, and so I'm free to repeat what I have learned, gleaned through him, and I apologise if I take with it any of his individual opinion or style in the process. But I do believe that he's a fairly what's the word? I don't want to say objective, but he's a fairly circumspect author. That's the word, circumspect. Oh, but I was when I was a baby. Sorry, that's Carry On. Anyway, yes, so Andrew Marr, and in 1911, the House of Lords was a real power. And as I said, this is the story of how it lost its power, because nowadays the House of Lords doesn't do anything at all in the legislative process. You could argue it does, but glossing, okay? The House of Lords doesn't do anything. What's with a pinch of salt in Latin? I learned this recently. Cum grano, that's it, with a grain. Sorry, we have gone down so many sidetracks. Anyway, yes, so in 1911 the House of Lords is a real power, and this is because the hereditary privilege of the Lords has really stayed the same. England, I would say, is an inherently conservative country, and it always has been. And this is not in the case of just, look, because the thing is, conservatism and the Conservative Party don't align. So that just the idea of conserving things, of things changing gradually, that is what I mean when I say England is a conservative country, because we're not prone to change things very rapidly in England. It's a very, very gradual change. And because of this, the House of Lords retained the aristocratic privilege of the ancient noble families, and have been going basically since, I beg your pardon, basically since the Norman conquest in many cases. That kind of thing still trickles down. And so the House of Lords really had, every time, I always do these after dinner, I'm always burping in the videos, I really hope you forgive me. Yes, because in this period, right, you've got the wealth and social standing go hand in hand with one another. I mean, there's always been cases of people who've got wealth without social standing and social standing without wealth, but in general, at this point in history, they are very closely linked, much more so than they are today. If you compare the very, very rich people today, they are very, very seldom linked to the people who are high in social standing, the innate breeding, as they would call it, I believe, innate breeding. Yes, so it is, and because of that, you get a House of Lords that is really genuinely powerful and can influence the decisions in the country. And also, a lot of legislation has been passed that has hindered the House of Lords, namely the one that we're going to talk about today, which is the Parliament Act. So, what's going on in the House of Commons in the early 20th century? Because, of course, the first century is the noughts, if you will, the nought hundreds. Because if you've got a century from, Christ, right, 100, that space is 100 years. So that's going to be the first century. But then the second century is obviously the 100s. I admit it's confusing, but it makes sense if you think about it. So the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, what's happening? The House of Commons, we have a Liberal government. Now, the Liberal Party are not exactly the same as today's Liberal Democrats, but they are the origins of it. Basically, the Labour Party had a bit of a schism at some point, and there was a breakaway party called the Social Democrats, who merged with the Liberals to create the Liberal Democrats. But at this point, the Labour Party is a relatively small party, and the two main parties are the Conservatives, who are still called Tories, even though the Tories was technically the party that came before, but all the members basically shifted. So yeah, the Tory Conservative Party, I might say Tory in this video, just because it's a nice word, and the Liberal Party. Now, the Liberals are not necessarily the party of the people, because the Labour Party does exist at this point. It was created late. It depends where you say created. I don't actually know when the establishment of the ILP, Independent Labour Party, was, but the trade unions movement was happening towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. So the Labour Party now emerges as a kind of significant third party. But at this stage, the people still feel that this fringe party is not powerful enough to really stand a chance against the Tories. So if you are a commoner, for example, I shouldn't say commoner actually, because there's... Okay, this is a tricky thing. The House of Commons, right? When we say commoners, you might think of the proletariat, but this is not what common means. Common literally just means not a lord or a royal. And so the calibre of people you're going to get in the Commons is very similar, actually, to what you're going to get in the Lords. But yes, so if you are a member of the proletariat, the working class, you are more likely to vote Liberal than Labour. That changes very quickly, but at this point in time, that's still the old convention that's coming through. And so we have a Liberal government under Henry Asquith. No. Herbert Henry Asquith. There he is. I thought it was Henry Herbert. It's Herbert Henry, I think, anyway. His name and photo will be on the screen anyway, so you can laugh at me later if you really, really want to. Yes, Herbert Asquith is the Liberal Prime Minister, and he has a Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is a man who was praised at the time as being the greatest man since Christ, the greatest orator that this country ever produced, the Welsh wizard, the Merlin of British politics. It is David Lloyd George. Who has no connection with the gyms, I can reassure you. And David Lloyd George is a really, really radical chap here. He's got immense ideas about changing the fabric of the country. Now, why he has these radical ideas is up for debate, because you may say that, oh, he had genuine concern for the people. And of course, that's all very nice, but also, remember, the Labour Party, right, is threatening the Liberal Party's position here as a party on the left, in a similar way that Reform UK is now threatening the good old Conservative Party on the right. And so Lloyd George, as a Liberal, if he's to have any chance of power at all, he's got to play this delicate game of keeping the sort of left-wing votes in his power base. You know, he's got to consolidate the left, as it were, keep the Labour Party out, make sure people know the Liberals are still the ones who are going to look after their interests best, and that way you can keep the Tories out, because otherwise you're going to split the left, the Tories are going to win. Unless you have a coalition government, and famously coalitions are always weak and wobbly, even though they're not, but they're always weak and wobbly, so you don't want a coalition government. So it's possible that these reforms Lloyd George was proposing was just a cynical toy in order to keep the Labour Party out, because he knew that if he didn't propose them, the Labour Party would. So this is co-optation, something that still happens today. It's the reason the Green Party doesn't get in power, because the Green Party's green policies get co-opted by the big parties, who just say, well, we're going to do what they do, and they have no chance of winning, so why not just vote for us? So it's possible Lloyd George was doing that. it's possible we won't really know. It's possible it was a bit of the two, actually. Yes. I will note, actually, because I'm not sure if it'll come up again in this video, my personal hero here, Winston Churchill, at this point in history, is a member of the Liberal Party, I believe, or at the very least he was an admirer of Lloyd George. He was really in the crowd who hyped up Lloyd George, as it were. Yes, he was a Liberal, actually. He had the Board of Trade at the time, which was Lloyd George's old job, but then he got promoted to Chancellor, so Churchill got promoted to Lloyd George's old job at the Board of Trade. Yes, so Churchill's behind this, and that's your you've got the three men, right? You've got Asquith, Lloyd George, and Churchill. That's your triad of Liberal politicians in charge of the government at this period in time. Now, Lloyd George's reforms, I've talked about them for a while. What are they? Well, it is all about welfare. Welfare. That's Lloyd. It's to use the style that would be later adopted by Tony Blair. You can't just say the same three words and make it a speech, Tony. But evidently you can. I can't fathom it, really. Somehow that's the kind of oratory people want nowadays. It's just saying education, education, education. Politics, honestly. Yes, so welfare is what's on Lloyd George's mind, and education is part of this, but it's also old age pensions and workplace health insurance and things like this. Not necessarily the NHS. That comes a lot later under Clement Attlee's Labour government after the Second World War, but a kind of looking after the working class, because a lot of our institutions nowadays that we think of as relatively unrevolutionary, back then they didn't exist. If you think about Victorian slum conditions, right, the workhouses, children in the workhouses, the regulations were really slow to catch up here, because we're still basically living in the after dregs of the Victorian era, in the Edwardian period, right, in the 1910s, the 1900s and 1910s. And so this is what Lloyd George wants to change, basically. He wants to bring in all this new welfare legislation to look after the people. He says that in a rich country like this, it really is appalling that people are allowed to die in, penury and starvation, or I believe his words. However, there are, of course, the Lords. And the Lords are not keen on this. Why? Why would the Lords not be keen on this? I mean, it doesn't necessarily make sense for the Lords to just reject any improvement of the working class, does it? No. And that is because of a key factor. Germany. You see, Germany is an emerging power on the European stage. Otto von Bismarck has united the German states, and Germany is a really rapidly rising star in the European scene. They've got proper welfare systems. They've got a proper, coordinated state. And what's more, they've got a proper modern army. And this army was striking terror into people at the time. The popular press was a relatively new thing at the time. What's he called? Mr. Harmsworth, I think he was. He was in the Lords as well, I believe. I've forgotten his lordly title, though. But yes, so Mr. Harmsworth sets up the Daily Mail. And so now newspapers are no longer the sort of thing that... I've got a sample, actually, of a newspaper from the 18th century. I can't show it to you now because it would take ages to get it down. Or actually, I can cut the shot out. I can cut the shot. I don't normally like cutting shots, but I can cut the shot and show you what an oldie-worldy newspaper looks like. And here we have it from the Finn Bond Personal Collection. For your viewing pleasure, we have an edition of the York Courant. This is the oldest thing I own. And is such very, very delicate. It's from 1733, and I acquired it accidentally as part of an auction. Now, the headlines are something to do with the French Revolution, but as you can see, this is not what a newspaper looks like nowadays, right? This is long, boring paragraphs, right? Very often excerpts from politicians' speeches. Remember, this is a time before you get radio and recording at all, really. Any kind of recording equipment is in it's bare bones at this point in time. And so the newspapers are how you would get a politician's speech. And so it would very often just be put in full. So the newspapers were not something readily accessible to the mass public. They're something that would be read by the more middle classes, perchance. But Mr. Harmsworth and his associates at this time, his people like him, changed this with the introduction of things like the Daily Mail, because this is this is a newspaper that appeals to the general reader. It's very simple. It's punchy. It's got headlines criticising politicians. What is it? There's the quote. It was in the book, actually. It's Mr. Harmsworth. He said, 3 things are always news. Money things, health things, and sex things. I think it was. That may be wrong, and I actually can't be bothered to check it. So we may never know. But yes, anyway, so the mass media happens, and Germany. Let's get back to Germany now. So Germany. Sorry, I'm all out of disarray after changing the shots. I'm not used to it. So Germany, right? Germany is the new rising star on the European stage. They boshed France, which is obviously a jolly good thing for a country to do. So that's really proving it's on the up. And this kind of shows Germany is the rising military star, and people were worried, genuinely worried in Britain that they would be next. That Germany was plotting to overthrow Britain, or at least invade. And this is reflected by the popular culture at the time. There was all sorts of fear-mongering that the Germans were planning to invade Britain. There were novels published about secret plans that were being discovered, and there was a publicity stunt, I think organised actually by the Daily Mail, where they had faux German soldiers, like people dressed up in German uniforms with spiked helmets and everything, marching through the streets of several coastal towns in Britain. And they printed issues saying the German invasion has begun, and that was just to show that people were really, really worried about this. And so it was that the British public, influenced by this mass media and this fear-mongering about Germany, demanded 8 new dreadnoughts. We want 8 and we won't wait, was the cry. And so Lloyd George, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, is clearly being pressed by his electorate to get new dreadnoughts. He's the Chancellor. He should direct funding to the Admiralty and get these 8 new dreadnoughts. However, he wants to make these welfare reforms. And dreadnoughts are absolutely ruinously expensive. They are the equivalent of nuclear weapons in today, right? The dreadnought was the peak of naval superiority. And that's just reminding me, actually, the Germans had their naval arms race with us as well. So there's another thing. This is why people said, okay, the Germans are now starting to rival the Royal Navy. This is a really bad thing. Have you not heard of the 2-power standard? We need to be able to beat the 2 other largest navies in the world. Okay, Lloyd George, this is a problem. 8 dreadnoughts now, please. But Lloyd George could not afford that and his welfare reforms. So it was a speech he delivered at the Edinburgh Castle, which was a weird sort of pub-type place in London. And he said that what we are going to have to do, and I am paraphrasing here, and I'm not going to do a Welsh accent because that would be embarrassing. I really want to now. What we're going to do is we are going to have a new super tax on the super wealthy. We're going to have a new massive inheritance tax that will hit the rich hard with their massive wealthy country estates. And this will raise the money necessary to have enough dreadnoughts and to give you your welfare reforms. Now, you can imagine the people of Britain were absolutely... what's the word? Were absolutely wholeheartedly behind this idea that they were gleaming with support. I haven't found my word, so we're just going to have to move on. That will irritate me for a while. But now you can possibly understand why the aristocracy, why the House of Lords and the wealthy peers, mostly Tory peers, were aghast. And actually liberals as well. Because this is the thing, when you're in this period, it's not so cleanly cut. Just as today, there are issues that divide political parties. So the former Liberal Prime Minister, the Earl of Rosebery, who was, like myself, a fellow insomniac, he actually took morphine. He was that bad with the insomnia. I don't think I'm that bad yet. But yes, he about as liberal as you can get, Liberal Prime Minister, for heaven's sake, said that this wasn't a budget, it was a revolution, and that Lloyd George is trying to overthrow the status quo with his economic meddling, trying to do this to the upper house. How dare he, a member of the Commons? What on earth is he thinking? And this was the general mood in the majority of the Lords. Now, there is such a thing as the Salisbury Convention, named after this chap. We've mentioned him on the channel before, friend of the channel, the Marquis of Salisbury. I won't reproduce his full titles and coat of arms here because I did that in my Cecil Rhodes video. yes, so he instigated this convention, which said that the Lords, and this still stands today, by the way, that the Lords must not oppose any bills passed by the Commons which were proposed in the general election manifesto of the winning party. And this would have meant that the Lords... Oh, and there's also the financial privilege as well. This is a new thing, is that the budget is basically out of the Lords' hands. And both of these conventions, these age-old conventions of the Constitution, because bear in mind the British Constitution is not like another constitution. People say that Britain has no constitution. It's not true. We have an uncodified constitution. It's not written down in one specific place like the United States Constitution. It's an ever-growing, ever-evolving thing made up of lots of different documents, of conventions, of traditions and things like this. And I think that's a much better system, really. This is perhaps a topic for another video. But yeah, so these constitutional conventions are basically being washed away because the House of Lords rejected the people's budget. They voted it out on a massive majority. I think it was 300 and something to 40 something. It was a staggering turnout for the books. The Lords voted in massive opposition to the bill. And this was perhaps suicidal because the convention was the Lords do not mess with the money. And the Lords had messed with the money. Granted, it was mostly their money that was going to be stolen. Or not stolen, obviously. All tax is stealing, obviously, but not necessarily stolen. But they would have viewed it as stealing. That their hard-earned, inherited wealth that has been garnered over generations of clever decision-making and wise government is going to be pilfered from them by this Welsh liberal, damn his eyes, to pay for some bloody pension scheme. Can't quite imagine it. What's up? I thought there was a moth for a second there. I think it was just the reflection in my glasses. Yeah, that's really weird. I don't like moths. I'm always worried they're going to eat my books. Where was I? Yes, so the peers basically thought that this was absolute downright robbery. And so you can quite understand, perhaps, why they voted massively against the bill in the Lords. And yet this was not the result that Asquith and Lloyd George and such were hoping for. And they had a trick up their sleeve as well. They went to the king. Now, you may also be aware, turning back to when I started this video, that there is basically, there's the two houses of Parliament, but that's not where it ends. Once something's passed the Commons and passed the Lords, it has to go to the King. And the King offers his royal assent, it's called, which means that the bill is approved by the King and can therefore pass because, as you may know, the police who enforce the laws get their authority from the King. So everything has to go back to the King. He's the font of all the power in this country. Everything revolves back to the King. And so it is that the Commons, under Asquith and under Lloyd George, decided they were going to try and overrule the Lords with a cunning bit of political treachery. They were going to go to the King and they were going to... and Lloyd George wrote a letter to the King that basically said, I would like you to create 400 or 500 extra liberal peers who are going to vote in favour of this bill. Of course, if you create new peers, then they're not going to have any of that aristocratic wealth. So they'll have no reason to vote it down. And so it was that Lloyd George said, Your Majesty, could you just make 500 lords? Now, Edward VII, who was king at the time, and was a member of the Bullingdon Club, which is really rather interesting. You may know this photograph, which I'm going to put all over the screen now, because it deserves close examination, which features future prime ministers, or future at the time, David Cameron and Boris Johnson, both sitting there in their resplendent-looking Bullingdon tailcoats. Yes, Edward VII was a member of the Bullingdon Club. Another member of the Bullingdon Club coming up later in the video as well. Yes, he thought this was entirely repugnant, did the king. He thought, this is treason, surely, this is terrible. But we're really moving into a stage where the monarch has very limited authority in Parliament. And so this was no longer a period where, like in Georgian times, for example, the king could just say, I don't want to do what you're telling me. So what the king did was he decided to try and buy for time and hope that it might go to the Winchester and wait for all this to blow over. Or not Winchester, go to Windsor and wait for all this to blow over. I'm prouder of that than I should be. Yes, so he said, right, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to call some general elections, because if we're going to perform this massive constitutional overhaul, we're going to have to prove that the general public really, really do want this, okay? So you're going to have another general election, and I'm going to need to see a landslide to prove that the people really want the people's budget. I believe there was 2 general elections in 1910, both of which were massively liberal in turnout. And so it was that he had a majority. Now, the king... I really like this line. I got it from that book. You can't see it. There we go. That was really seamless. Well done, Bond. An utterly impartial history of Britain, or 2,000 years of upper-class idiots in charge. It said, the king was dumbfounded by this problem, and so he died. Now, I read that at about 3 in the morning on very little sleep, and that made me chuckle uproariously. And he was replaced by his son, King George V, who was a very, very good monarch. Now, King George V was a wise man, I would argue, and he saw that the tide was coming the other way. So he threatened the Lords. He said, look, you are going to have to pass this bill. It's inevitable now. I will do the peering. I will make the peers. So you're just going to have to bite the bullet and do it. Now, it is at this point we enter another friend of the channel, another former member of the Bullingdon Club, George Nathaniel Marquis Curzon of Kedleston, whose house I really want to go and visit. There he is, good old chap, Lord Curzon. Now, Lord Curzon, let's see, I'm going to read directly from the book here because it's a quote, I want to get this right. He was addressing a dinner in May 1911, and he is quoted as saying, "Let them make their peers. We will die in the last ditch before we give in." And this is where you get the name Ditcher, and that was the name of his faction. The faction in the Lords that wanted to fight until the very end to preserve their rights and to hold out against the king's peers. The king's new liberal peers, that is. And so it was that we have the factions, the Hedgers, and then there was... Sorry, I've preempted myself. There was the Ditchers, who were with Curzon, who wanted to stay firm till the very end, and there was the Hedgers, who presumably got their name from wanting to hedge their bets. That's just a conjecture, though. It doesn't actually mention where the name comes from. Now, Curzon was very quickly to turn over to the other side. He was later quoted as saying, anyone who still decides to fight at this point deserves to be sent to the lunatic asylum. But the Hedgers were accompanied by another chap who has a famous name. That is the first Baron Rothschild. Now, the first Baron Rothschild, very interesting chap, actually. He is where Cecil Rhodes got a lot of his money from, and is where Benjamin Disraeli got the money to buy the Suez Canal. So, thoroughly interesting chap there. But he was in favour of the Hedgers. He said, we're going to stand up against this nonsense. And so was Willoughby de Brooke, who is mentioned in the book. I don't actually know a great deal about him, but he seems a funny chap. And he is quoted as saying that he was ready to defend the hereditary principle, whether it referred to peers or to foxhounds, which I think is quite humorous, of course. Now, there you have your factions, the Hedgers and the Ditchers, and it is this date, the 8th of August, which saw their showdown in the House of Lords. They got together and they bandied it to and fro. They were going to have a serious set to. And they came dressed for the occasion because the Hedgers, many of them came wearing white heather in their buttonholes. Buttonholes, they're flowers, essentially, that you wear through the buttonhole of your lapel. They were a recognised symbol of political expression at the time. Joseph Chamberlain, another friend of the channel, always wore an orchid through his buttonhole, and that was a good way of getting recognised at the time. So it was that the Hedgers wore their white heather, and the Ditchers wore red roses. And so you can imagine the people filing into the two sides of the Lord's chamber with the appropriate floral buttonhole and having a thorough set to. However, it was not to be so for long, because just like Curzon, many of the Hedgers saw that the jig was up and saw that these lords are going to get created, and it's better to retain the aristocratic privilege in the Commons and lose some of in the Lords, and lose some of their power, as long as they would still be able to have majorities. Because if there were 500 new Liberal peers, that's just ridiculous. They're not going to have a majority until a lot of those die off. So a lot of the Tories and things, they saw the turn of the tide and they went over to the Hedgers. Now, many of the chaps who didn't want to be seen doing this thought that it would be a clever thing to just sort of sneak out, leave the chamber, and therefore abstain from the vote and let it go its way. And, oh, did we lose? What a great shame. You know, I had to go. It was the thing. Now, Willoughby de Brooke, who I mentioned earlier, saw this coming. And there was one duke, I don't know which duke, who was particularly important, seemingly, and wanted to be retained for the vote. So Willoughby de Brooke stole his hat and coat and kept him safe, because he thought, if I have his hat and coat, he won't be able to run away. And this is at a time where that was a justifiable theory, because, you know, for an ordinary civilian to go about without a hat on would have been unthinkable, let alone a duke. And yet, it shows you the duke ran out into the night without his hat and coat, and it's a potent image, if you will. This is straight from Mara. It's a potent image of the collapse of the aristocracy, because it was so that it ended. It ended running out into the night, stripped of that aristocratic dignity which had previously bedraggled the peers, and so the People's Budget passed. And so it was that Lloyd George got his way, and so it was that, as I promised you, the House of Peers was thwarted and put into its place. There followed the Parliament Acts, which restrained the Lord's power of veto, which meant that they were now reduced, as they are now, to delay. They can only delay bills, because now the Lords cannot thoroughly reject any bill proposed by the Commons. They can delay it for a year at most. That's a result of the second Parliament Act. The first one was a delay for 2 years. And so this is a really... This is a cornerstone changing point for the British Constitution, I would argue. It's a really important date, and it shows the decline of the old power of the aristocracy. And this point in the video marks the decline of the moisture in my throat. I'm absolutely barren. So I'm so sorry for all the cuts in this video. I really don't like doing them. But I'm going to have to go get some water, and I'll be back for the more... Can you believe it? The more rambling part of the video. I needed that thoroughly. Can you believe I got this for free in Germany? Very nice, isn't it? Honestly, Germans, very nice people, really, needing to bother with those dreadnoughts. Unfortunately, it's not a half pint, it's metric, but I can live with that, I suppose. Anyway, so the aristocrats were thwarted, the House of Lords was placed into submission, and that's how it remains today. However, you may be interested to know, what flower would I be wearing in my buttonhole if I were a peer back in the day? Well, more than likely I'd be wearing white heather, to be honest with you. But if I was just a chap like I am nowadays, which buttonhole would I be wearing right now? Still white heather. Now, you may be thinking me thoroughly retrograde. How dare you? How dare you? Do you hate the working people? Are you some kind of stuck-up twit? No. But what I would say is the ramifications of that debate well, I just realised it's awfully big-headed of me just declaring I'm not a stuck-up twit. I may very well be a stuck-up twit. That thing is in the eye of the beholder. But I would argue that this is not because I hate the working people, definitely, because I don't. It's just that it was perhaps a reasonable measure to be taken at the time to thwart aristocrats in the House of Lords. However, what that has left us with is a legacy, right? And the House of Lords no longer conforms to these old ideas of aristocratic wealth and blue blood and influence, right? It's no longer possible to have a House of Lords with ministers in it. You don't get ministers. There was uproar when the Sunak government put David Cameron into the Foreign Office, because that's a major government position. And of course, a lord could never have a major government position. There used to be whole ministries, prime ministers and home secretaries and foreign secretaries all coming from the House of Lords. And yet you don't see this anymore. And that was not as big a problem at the time, because politicians were not the same as they are nowadays. Like I said, they're a different calibre. And so what you saw generally was you saw experienced people in the House of Commons, people with life experience. And this meant that they were well suited to individual ministries once they got into government. You very infrequently saw the career politician back then. Nowadays, you hardly see anything else. The career politician basically joins a political party when they're very, very young, maybe even my age in some instances, sticks there and eventually gets elected. And so all they have done with their life is study politics. And this was an infrequent thing. You didn't study politics. Politics was just a way of life that you had alongside your day-to-day, the way you earn your crust, as it were. Because, of course, paid MPs were not a thing until relatively recently. It was the Wilson government and Barbara Castle who introduced the pay for MPs. It may interest you to think, actually, that the Labour MPs were the ones who introduced MPs getting paid. And that was because they didn't want exclusively rich people being MPs. So now you can have an MP who is actually from a working class background. But previously you didn't have MPs being paid. And so they had to do something else with their life in order to earn money. Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to pay for all the expenses of your life and the immense electoral expenses and, you know, the staff you would have to hire, the stationery costs, heaven forfend, all those fountain pens that you would have to buy for being a politician. So you needed to have experience outside of politics. And so that was all fine and dandy then, if you had that back in the day. But now, what we have is a lower house, right, the House of Commons, which is very democratic, I would argue, very democratic. A lot of people think the first past the post isn't a very good electoral system, but honestly, please just... It's fine, okay? It's fine. It's the most simple system ever, and that is not to its discredit. It works perfectly fine. We get a very quick result. It's all fine and dandy, I would argue. Tested by the ages, too. And then you have that... Well, yes, so you have this lower house that's very democratic, but has no experience anymore. You have politicians who don't actually know anything about the world because all they've studied is politics. Whereas back in the day, you had people who knew about things. I remember it's The Political Animal, Jeremy Paxman, very, very good book. Paxman's a brilliant author, by the way. I've mentioned this earlier, but brilliant author. And he talks about this one particular MP. I'm rubbish at this. I've forgotten the name. So, yes, there's one particular MP who had experience with the army, and he told there was an account of some other chap who said whenever this bloke got up to speak, we all sat down and listened. But it's rare to see that kind of specialism nowadays. You get people who are career politicians who don't have experience in any particular walk of life. And so we conflate democratically elected with good in our political system, and that's not necessarily untrue. But what it does mean is we have sacrificed a thoroughly useful asset in the House of Lords. Nowadays, if you look at the House of Lords, what is there? Predominantly life peers. Now, life peerages were originally introduced for judges, because a judge is a really particular sector that requires a really in-depth knowledge, right? And so if you have a judge's son inheriting a judge's position in the House of Lords, you're going to end up with a real sticky situation, right? However, Tony Blair had his government, and he really, really beat the coherence out of aristocracy in the House of Lords, and he reduced it to 92 hereditary peerages, maximum, no more than 92. And so now the majority of the 800-strong House of Peers are life peers. Now, life peerages are handed out for two reasons. Either because you've been very, very nice to a political party, and that political party happened to be in power, and the Prime Minister's resignation honours just happen to have your name in it because, oh, you're a jolly good bloke, and also there's 500 quid. Now, that's a practice I would actually clamp down on. So be aware, I don't support that kind of political cronyism. It's just ungentlemanly, frankly. But the other side of life peerages is you get people who are immensely experienced in individual sectors. We get given loads of examples for the A level, so I'm just going to tell you, like Lord Dubs is one, for example. He came to Britain on the Kinder transport and escaped Nazi Germany, and so he's got a really key insight into immigration matters, which are particularly poignant in Britain nowadays. And you get all sorts of people. You get people like doctors and athletes. And Andrew Lloyd Webber knows a lot about musicals, and he's famously a pretty bad peer, but he knows about musicals, damn it. So if there was a bill on musicals, he would be prepared to lend a hand to that. And so you see the kind of specialism that used to be seen in the Commons as well. Well, in the Commons exclusively, rather, being shifted to the Lords, and yet there has been no shifting of power to represent that experience. Because I would say there are two ways of having authority, legitimacy in a country, right, like this. You have democratic election and you have experience. And at the minute, there is a mandate for the former, there is no mandate for the latter, because the latter is concentrated almost entirely in the House of Lords, who can do absolutely nothing short of advice to stop the government's bills. So, I believe that what we should do is carefully re-examine our existing political structure, because what we have is the potential to have a really useful constitutional block against populism, basically. A government body that could rationally think through things. Because another thing is the Commons is really bad on scrutiny. It does not give appropriate time to bills, because of course the Commons are elected. And so, quick, get all of our things done. Quick, we've got a manifesto, just tick, just boom, through. Forget about the committee stage. We don't need to review what do we review the bill? It's in the manifesto. Go, get it through. And so you don't scrutinise things, because if you have a government in the Commons, you likely have a majority in the Commons. And if you have a majority in the Commons, you don't even need to debate things. You could just vote, and if you whip your MPs well enough, which Keir Starmer hasn't been doing a very good job of, Rachel Maskell, if you whip your MPs hard enough, then you can just pass anything you want, so long as the votes are in your favour, right? And they always are, because you have a majority in the Commons. So there is no accurate scrutiny, there's no time taken, whereas the House of Lords, right? If I'm a peer, I've not got to stand for election anywhere, do I? I'm here until I kick the bucket. And so I can take as long as I want to think what is good for the country. Because realistically, what, influences are there? No one can remove me from my peerage. I am a peer, I'm a lord. Get used to it. Like, even the people who put me in, if I'm here as part of the Prime Minister's resignation honours, the ex-Prime Minister, who's going to end up in the House of Lords, possibly himself, can't do anything. And a House of Lords whip is thoroughly useless. It'd be like whipping someone with a strawberry bootlace. It's completely toothless. So the whips are no good in the House of Lords. And what you have is people who have not got to wait for an election, have not got to be campaigning as well. And so they can sit down and think it through. And another thing that you have is it allows people with experience to lend their weight to government decisions without having to be a politician, because being a politician is very demanding. You've got a full-time job on your hands there. Lots and lots of work to be done. If you are a doctor, right, the top neurosurgeon in this country, and you know so much about neurosurgery that you could lend a new hand to, I don't know, a new bill on brain surgery, just because I couldn't think of a good example. Well, you can't stand for a seat in the Commons. We don't have rotten boroughs anymore. This is a case in favour of the rotten boroughs, as you can get a chap into the House of Commons very quickly. But that was only necessary before you have life peerages. You can appoint someone based on merit. You don't need a rotten borough anymore. And so what you can do is you can give the top neurosurgeons in the country, you can give them peerages. And so for, bills on land tenure and inheritance, if they don't care, then they don't have to come in. But something that they care about and something that they believe is right, like a bill on neurosurgery, they can turn up, lend their vote. And because peers only get paid for turning up, then we don't waste any taxpayer money on a politician's salary. So what I'm driving at here is the House of Peers is not perfect. Obviously, you get people like Andrew Lloyd Webber, who comes in his private jet across the Atlantic to come and vote on immigration bills and then go straight back to America, right? And then you get there was the expenses scandal of peers literally turning up in taxis, running in, signing in the book, and then running back out to the taxi, leaving the taxi running. And I'm not saying peers are perfect, by no means. Peers are humans. We're no longer living in the divine right of kings time, where we believe in the feudal order set by God, and that peers are therefore above us and superior creatures. They're humans. And like humans, there is going to be a dichotomy of good and bad, and that dichotomy doesn't lie between party lines or between opinion lines or religion or whatever. It lies in the individuals. Every individual person is bad and good. That's inherently based on our definitions of bad and good. I'm straying into arguments about human nature here, but safe to say, obviously peers aren't perfect. What I'm saying is we've got a tool and we could use that properly, but instead what we're doing is we're carrying on with a David Lloyd George mindset of thinking that peers are aristocrats and they're unelected and that's bad and therefore we should shun them from the process of government. But imagine, for example, a foreign secretary who had immense experience, who had perhaps been an ambassador in a foreign country, which you couldn't do at the same time as being in the House of Commons. That would be a boon to the government, wouldn't it? A minister with that level of experience would know what they were doing. And so I just think we're wasting a massive opportunity here to use the House of Lords for good, to bring it into the modern age. This is not about retrogression, what I'm suggesting here. I don't think that this is an inherently dragging people backwards through history. No, what we're doing is dragging a historical institution forward into the modern day. And I think it's really something worth doing, because we could have a really experienced voice in the government. And I also think that it could be a way of protecting the kind of rights that we want to keep protected. For example, human rights. Now, the idea of human rights doesn't really sit necessarily well with me. I prefer to think of ancient liberties, right? As Englishmen, right, we all have our liberties that have been protected for generations. And of course, the definition of free Englishman has come a long way since King John's barons, right? But essentially, since then, free Englishmen have been guaranteed these rights to trial by their peers and not to be, subject to cruel and inhuman punishment, things like this. So I like this idea of ancient liberties that have been tested by time and are not just pulled out of nowhere, right? Because if you think about it, human rights kind of are pulled out of nowhere. They're just sort of what people think people ought to be entitled to. Whereas ancient liberties, we know that works, right? We have seen centuries of people being afforded these liberties and it working for them. So yes, I think ancient liberties are much more the way to go than your human rights malarkey. But yes, the House of Peers, say we pass a bill that says they are allowed to reject bills that harm these ancient liberties. Well, then you've used the House of Peers for good. You've defended something that needs defending, haven't you? And you've got a really good constitutional safeguard there. So, my message to you is, what happened on the 8th of August 1911 was probably for the good in the short term, but it set a precedent that is a very, very bad thing. And that what we could do well to remember is that we've come a long way since 1911, when the House of Lords is no longer chock full of blue blood. It is a useful tool for the modern British Constitution, and I think we could really make use of it. So, I hope you all have a good day on this anniversary, and I propose a toast to you from my water jug that I got from Germany. Until then, carry on, I suppose.